Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Shayantani Pal, Associate Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today our subject is the social and cultural history of India, and today we shall discuss about a very important topic, that is the Samskaras and the Rnas. Now here are our learning objectives. The Samskaras as the traditional rules of Hindu religious life. Then we shall discuss the 4 stages of life. These are very important because the 4 stages of life, all of us know from our school textbooks that there are 4 stages of life. So we shall discuss regarding these things. Then we shall discuss on the Samskaras before birth. So it is very interesting to learn that the Samskaras actually began before the birth of a child. Then we shall discuss upon the Samskaras at the time of birth, then the Samskaras after birth, the Samskaras related to studenthood, the Samskaras related to the family life, and the Samskaras related to death. So from a baby is being born, before that and also after his death, the Samskaras are continued to be performed throughout the whole journey of life of a person. So to introduce the subject, what are the sources for learning about the Samskaras? It is the Vedic texts. The Vedic texts actually refer to the Samskaras in early India. These are the Grijya Sutras. The Grijya Sutras actually discuss about the domestic rites to be performed in the household. So these are called the Grijya Sutras. The Grijya Sutras dealing with domestic religious ceremonies embodies a vast number of traditional rules for the religious life of the Hindu household, of which many are of ancient origin. These rituals or samskaras are based upon the fundamental principles of Vedic religion. They are addressed to the ancient gods of the Vedas, and images and temples are of no relevance in this context. So this is a very important point, that samskaras had their origin in the Vedic period, and in the later texts like the Puranas, like the Dharma Shastras, they are not the sources of the samskaras. Every rules and principles of the samskaras were actually laid down in the Vedas, and it is the Vedas, the Vedic gods, to whom these samskaras are actually pointed to. Now to begin with the 4 stages of life. Now all of us are familiar with the 4 stages of life. What are the 4 stages of life? These are: the first, a man becomes a brahmachari. So the first stage is brahmacharya. On his investiture with the sacred thread, that is upanayana, when a student who has put his childhood behind him, he became a brahmacharin, leading a celibate and austere life as a student at the home of his teacher, that is the ashrama, which is essentially the hermitage, and it is situated in isolated places, often in the forest and far removed from the city. Next, having mastered the Veda and part of them, he returned to his paternal home and he gets married and he becomes a householder, and householder is called a grihastha. So garhasthya is the second stage of life. Then the third stage of life, which is called the vanaprastha. When well advanced in middle age, the person had seen his children's children. When he had seen his children's children, that is his grandsons, and had thus surely established his line, he left his home for the forest to become a hermit. So this is called the vanaprastha, which is the third stage of a man's life. Next, the last stage, which is called sannyasa, that is by meditation and penance, the person freed his soul from material things until at last, a very old man, he left his hermitage and became a homeless wanderer, that is a sannyasi, with all his earthly ties broken. But whether in reality these 4 stages of life were actually observed by every people in his life, that was probably not the case. In reality, the scheme represents the ideal rather than the real state of things. Many young men never passed through the first stage of life in the form laid down, while only a few went beyond the second. Many of the hermits and ascetics of ancient India, as even now, they were not actually old men, they were young people who are hermits, and they had either shortened or omitted the stage of householder. The series of the 4 stages is evidently a realization of the facts and an artificial attempt to find room for the conflicting claims of study, that is the family life and asceticism. Now the family life is on the one side and asceticism is another thing which is just opposite to the family life. So there was an attempt to put these contrasting things together in one single journey of life, which is actually not possible. Now the samskaras, we have discussed about the 4 stages of life, and now we shall discuss about the samskaras. So now we shall discuss about the samskaras. Actually, as I have already told you, that the samskaras begin from before the birth of a child. According to the scheme of the 4 stages, life began not with the physical birth but with the second birth or investiture with the sacred thread, which is called the Upanayana ceremony. So with Upanayana, a child is born again. So they are now called the Dvijas, that is the twice born. Thus the child was not a full member of the Aryan community, but nevertheless his existence was hedged around with religious rites which began before his birth. According to texts on the subject, as I have already told you, that is, it is the Grijya Sutras which discuss about the samskaras. So the text here means the Grijya Sutra. So according to the text on the subject, there were some more than 40 ceremonies, that is 40 samskaras, which covered the whole life of a man from his conception to his death. Some of these were of great importance and were performed by all respectable members of the Aryan community, while others were often neglected by the less pious. So it is not necessary that a person should perform all the 40 samskaras throughout his journey of life. Some performed 10 to 15, other may perform just 5 to 10. So this was the case. So a performance of every samskara was not necessary for a man throughout his life. Now first we shall discuss about the samskaras before a child is born. So the samskaras before the birth. The first samskara before the child is born, it is called the Garbhadhana. What is Garbhadhana? The ceremony of Garbhadhana was carried out to promote conception. So this is the Garbhadhana ceremony. Then the next ceremony is Pumsavana. The ceremony of Pumsavana was carried out to procure a male child. What are the rites? It was performed in the 2nd, 3rd or 4th month of pregnancy. Its chief feature was that after certain symbolic rites, a twig of the Nyagrodho, or according to certain authors, the Kusha grass or the twigs of the Soma plant was pounded between millstones, and it was put into the right nostril of the pregnant woman. So this is called the Pumsavana, which is aimed at the birth of a male child. Then the 3rd samskara to be performed before birth is Garbha Rakshan. The ceremony of Garbha Rakshana was performed to secure the welfare of the unborn baby and was carried out in the 4th month of the pregnancy. So the aim of Garbha Rakshana is the protection of the child in his mother's womb. Now the next rite to be performed is Simantonnayana. The ceremony of Simantonnayana was carried out to ensure the safety of the child in the womb. What is the ceremony? This ceremony is actually the ceremony of hair parting, and it was performed at different times. Offerings were made, the mother sitting behind the household fire. The household fire is actually the fire which is always lit up in the home. After this, her hair was solemnly parted. Now, after we have finished the discussion over the samskaras to be performed before the birth of the child, now we shall discuss about the samskaras at the time of the birth of a child. The first samskara to be performed at the time of birth is called Soshyanti Homa. It was carried out at the beginning of the birth of a child. What happened? A special hut, the Sutika Griha or the Sutika Gara, it was made for the reception of the mother during the birth, and at its door a birth fire, which is different from the household fire which I have already discussed. A birth fire, the Sutikagni, was kindled. The Grijya Sutras ordered the grains mixed with mustard to be thrown into the fire to protect the child. This was done daily until the 10th day. On the 12th day, the mother and child were to be bathed, the house formally purified, and the birth fire put out. The household fire, which was put out at the beginning of the birth, was now restored. The next ceremony to be performed at the birth of a child is called Jata Karma. Jata Karma or the birth ceremony took place before the cutting of the umbilical cord and involved the whispering of sacred spells, which are called the mantras, in the baby's ear, placing a mixture of honey and ghee in his mouth and giving him a name to be kept secret by his parents until his initiation. At birth, the child and his parents were ritually impure, and therefore they were not entitled to take part in the ordinary religious ceremonies until 10 days, when the child was obtained a public name and the period of impurity then is complete. Now we shall discuss about the samskaras after the birth of the child. The first samskara after the birth of the child is called nishkramana. The minor rites of infancy, not always looked on as particularly sacred, were like the nishkramana, when the child was taken out of the house and shown the sun for the first time. So this ceremony is called nishkramana. Now, the rite to be performed after nishkramana was called medha janana, which is a rite carried out to inspire intelligence into the child, in which normally a formula was whispered into the child's ear and sometimes he was given some food. The next ceremony, which is very important, is namakarana, the rite of naming a child. This could be performed at various times. Usually, a child was given two alternative names, one for common use and the other a secret name. The common name was given to the child with ceremony. So, this ceremony is called the Namakarana ceremony. Then Annaprasana. All of us are familiar. These rites are performed even today and it is a very important ceremony for a child. The Annaprasana is actually means giving solid food to the child. So more important was the first feeding of solid food to the child, which is called Annaprasana. In the child's 6th month, he was given meat, fish or rice. Nowadays, we generally give rice only for performing the Annaprasana ceremony. The rice is given mixed with curds, honey and ghee to the accompaniment of Vedic verses and oblations of ghee poured on the fire. So, this is the Annaprasana ceremony. Now, the next ceremony is Chura Karma. The tonsure took place in the 3rd year of the child and was confined to boys, not the girls. With various rites, the child's scalp was shaved, leaving only a top knot, which in the case of a pious Brahman would never be cut throughout his life. Although this rite was usually performed in the 3rd year, the rules actually varied. Some prescribed the 1st year for the Brahmanas, the 5th for the Kshatriyas, the 7th for the Vaishyas, and so on. So there are differences in the castes for whom the ceremony is actually performed. Also in this rite, a porcupine's spine or stalks of the kusha were laid in a boy's hair when the tonsure was made. The next ceremony is Karna Vedha, the piercing of the ear. The ceremony of the piercing of the ears took place when the boy was 3 or 5 years of age. Now, the Vidya-rambham, that is beginning of the learning. And this ceremony was carried out when the child first began to learn the alphabet. Normally, a boy began to learn the alphabet in his 4th or 5th year. In the richer homes, tutors were maintained for the child of the family, but in the Middle Ages, education was also given at village schools which were attached to temples. So these are the places where the Vidya-rambham were performed for a child. Next, the samskaras after the birth is through women's education was never looked on as essential. You may think that I am always talking about the boys, the boy child. What about the girl child? Though women's education was never looked on as essential, girls were by no means neglected and well-bred women were usually literate. The curriculum of the child's early studies seems always to have included reading and elementary arithmetic, but at this stage of his life, he was not a full member of the Aryan community and his formal schooling had not yet commenced. Now, the Upanayana ceremony. This ceremony is also continuing even nowadays. It is a very important ceremony from the Brahmanas, but remember that nowadays this ceremony is only performed for a Brahmana child, but in the Vedic period this ceremony was performed for the Brahmanas, the Kshatriyas as well as for the Vaishyas. Only the Shudras were excluded from the performance of this kind of ceremony. What is the Upanayana? The Upanayana is the great rite, the second birth whereby a boy become a full member of his class and of society. It was confined to the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, as I have already discussed. The Sudras and the lower orders could not undergo it, and it was never allowed to hear to or learn the most sacred of the scriptures. So, for this reason that they should not study or hear the scriptures, so a Shudra was excluded from the performance of a Upanayana ceremony. The ideal age for the ceremony again varied according to the caste. 8 years for a Brahmana boy, 11 for a Kshatriya and 12 for a Vaishya. Now, the Upanayana was a very ancient rite going back to times before the Aryans divided India and Iranian branches. So, the ceremony of Upanayana actually occurs in the Iranian texts also. The Zoroastrians had a similar ceremony, a form of which is still practiced by the modern Parsis. The kernel of the ceremony was the investing of the boy clad in the garments of an ascetic and with a staff in his hand with a sacred thread which is called Yagapavita, which was put under his left shoulder and under his right arm, and he was expected to wear continuously this thread throughout his life. The cord consisted of 3 threads, each of 9 twisted strands made of cotton, hemp or wool for the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas respectively. So, even here you can see the difference for the Brahmanas, Vaishyas and the Kshatriyas. Its removal or defilement involved its owner in humiliation and ritual impurity, which could only be expunged by the rigorous penance. The ceremony also included the whispering of the Gayatri in the ear of the initiate by officiating Brahmanas. This spell or mantra is actually addressed to the solar god Savitri, who appears in the Vedic text. The verse is still looked on as the most holy passage of the most holy text. All of us are familiar about this mantra. It is repeated in all religious rites and ceremonies and has a position in Hinduism rather like that of the Lord's Prayer in Christianity, except that the Gayatri may only be uttered by the 3 higher classes and not by the Shudra. So what is the Gayatri? All of us know about it. Tat Savitur Varenyam Varga Devasya Dhimahi Dhyo yo na prachodayat. Let us think on the lovely splendor of the god Savitri, that he may inspire our souls. Probably even before the Christian era, many Kshatriyas and Vaishyas had ceased to perform the initiation ceremony in full form, for the term twice born or bija applied to all who had undergone the ceremony became more and more looked on as a synonym of Brahmana. Some non-Brahmana castes, however, maintain the ceremony to the present day, and it is still performed in orthodox Brahmana families. Normally in the Vedic age, the boys and perhaps also girls were also initiated, but nowadays it is only the boys who gets this ceremony. The girls never perform Upanayana. Now the samskaras related to the studenthood. After the Upanayana ceremony, the initiated boy is still a minor, but he had taken the status of an Aryan. And as a brahmachari, it was now his duty to master the religious lore of the Aryans in order to prepare himself for the role of a householder. The subjects taught were the Vedas and the literature, orally recited and usually preceded by various rites and ascetic observances. The opening of the school, which is called Upakarma, attended with sacrifices and other rites, usually took place when the moon was in the asterisms Shravana or Hasta and were followed by a holiday of 3 days. The first term of the session usually lasted about 6 months, ending in the month of Magha, though sometimes it was about 4 months long. The second term began soon after. Each time it was followed by a holiday by 3 days. Besides, there were other short breaks in between the study. Ideally, the studenthood lasted for 12 years, though it might be terminated when the student had mastered one Veda. A few very earnest students took vows of perpetual celibacy and continued religious studies throughout their whole lives. Normally, however, the young man in his early 20s would return home to resume the everyday life of his class, but not before some rituals were performed. Before relinquishing his student life, he would take a ritual bath and reward his teacher according to the means of his family. From now on, he was a snataka, one who has bathed, and he might enjoy normal and worldly pleasures, eat any kind of food usually eaten by his class, and wear fine clothes and jewelry, which he put on special homecoming ceremony, which is called the Samavartana. Nowadays, Samavartana is even performed after one attains the postgraduate degree, but the Samavartana of the Vedic period was definitely had a separate impact. Now his nails and hair was cut, his teeth are cleaned, and a fire kindled, and sacrifices were offered to perform this ceremony. According to some authorities, the stuff, skin and sacred cord that he had hitherto carried were to be thrown into the water. He was duly dressed and equipped, according to some, with earrings, parasol, shoes, a pair of robes, jewel, staff, turban, crown of flowers, powder for rubbing his body, and ointment. After passing the day in solitude, and when the stars are seen, he went towards the north or the east. He worshipped the quarters and he sees the moon, and then he was free to go wherever he wanted. Now, the samskara of Keshanta, the shaving of the beard, is called the Keshanta. Actually, the shaving of the hair is called the Keshanta. The shaving of the beard was commonly performed in the 16th year, though some prescribe the 18th year, and others have the date to be determined by the family custom. Manu, who belongs to the 2nd century BC and is the earliest of the Dharmashastra authors, he prescribes the 22nd year for the Kshatriya and the 24th year for the Vaishya for the performance of this ceremony. So there is again different on the basis of caste for the performance of a particular ceremony. The hair on the head, face and body was shaved, and the nails trimmed with rites similar to those of the Chura Karma. The rite was accorded with Godana or gift or oxen to the Brahmanas. Now the family life begins, and now we shall discuss about the samskaras to be performed during the family life. It was generally thought advisable for a snataka to marry, vivaha, as soon as possible, for unless he had taken a vow of religious celibacy, marriage and the procreation of child were a positive duty. Marriage had three main purposes: the promotion of religion by the performance of household sacrifices, progeny, whereby the father and his ancestors were assured of a happy afterlife and the line was continued, and rati or sexual pleasure. Now we come upon to discuss the death ceremonies, which is called the Antyeshti. The funeral ceremonies, the Antyeshti, were the last of the many sacraments which mark the stages of a man's life. According to the most favored Aryan custom, the corpse was carried to the burning ground as soon as possible after the death, followed by the mourners and led by the eldest one. The corpse was cremated to the accompaniment of sacred texts. The mourners circumambulated the pyre, not in the auspicious clockwise direction, but in the anti-clockwise direction. So there is a difference. Then the mourners bathed in the nearest river, tank or lake and returned home, this time led by the youngest. On the third day after the cremation, the charred bones of the dead were gathered up and they were thrown into the river, preferably the Ganges. For 10 days after the cremation, libations of water were poured for the dead and offerings of rice balls, which is called pinda, and vessels of milk were made for him. On death, a man's soul becomes a miserable ghost, that is preta. He becomes a preta, and he is unable to pass on to the world of the fathers or to a new birth, and liable to do harm to the surviving relatives. So with the performance of the last Antyeshti rite on the 10th day, it acquired a subtle body. It acquired a subtle body to continue his journey. It speeded on his way and nourished in the afterlife with the pindas of the periodical Shraddha ceremonies. Now to summarize, the samskaras bear witness in the simple beliefs prevalent amongst the people. The ancient Indians believed that a man's life was continually being influenced by supernatural forces, both benevolent and malevolent, which required either to be welcomed or appeased or driven away. So priests in ancient India aimed at imposing some sort of injunctions in order to promote social order and welfare alongside religious practices. So the samskaras is actually directed towards maintaining social order and maintaining discipline one's life. Now Parashara, who is a Dharma Shastra writer, he opines that with the following of the samskaras, the all-round development of a man's personality can be achieved, and this leads to a disciplined life. This is aimed at achieving a higher spiritual life among the common people. It was believed that the samskaras actually enabled a man to rid his body of all impurities and make it the repository of a pure soul. So the attainment of a pure soul is actually the objective of performing samskaras throughout the life. To realize the Brahman by studying the Vedas, to keep promises, to make oblations to the gods, to perform yagnas, to procreate sons, and to perform the 5 mahayagnas and other sacrifices were the purposes for which the human body was created. Many of these ceremonies are nowadays practiced in their full form, and it is doubtful if ever ancient Indians of higher classes performed them regularly, especially in the case of girls. So we have discussed about the samskaras and about the 4 stages of life to be performed throughout a man's journey. I did not talk about the girls. We do not know whether these samskaras were also meant for the girls, but the real objective of performing samskaras were actually to lead a disciplined life. Thank you.